Hello everyone, welcome to another video. So in this video we'll be solving this problem of Leetcode. So the problem is of medium difficulty. So let's quickly read the problem. It's a pretty straightforward problem that you are given a matrix of m cross n, and there would be, if you find an element in that matrix which is 0, you need to set that entire row and that entire row and that entire column to be 0. So that's the problem. So they have given this example here. There is 0 in the middle, so you set that entire row and the entire column as 0, as you can see in the solution. So a straightforward solution is you have to create a same matrix, just kind of duplicate a matrix of m cross n and start filling that matrix. Now how you have to fill it? Just keep on copying the elements one by one. If you get a 0 at that point of time, make that particular row and particular column as 0 in the temporary matrix that you just created, and keep your original matrix as it is. We won't be making any change in the original matrix. So if we do this, we'll get the solution, right? And why we are not making change in the original matrix? Because that might confuse with the that might confuse you if the 0 was present initially, or you have created that 0. So for example, 0 is present here. If you make changes in the original matrix and make this entire row and column 0, and when you come down here, like when you reach here, there would be a 0 present. Now you don't know that this 0 was present initially or you created it, so you might turn this whole row 0 because the 0 is present here. So that's why we won't make changes in the original matrix. We are making it in a separate matrix, which is a temporary matrix. But here's the deal: you are using an extra space of m cross n. So a follow-up question, like they have very nicely mentioned here, that you can't use m cross n space. It's a bad idea to use it. So they have mentioned that a simple improvement uses a space of m plus n. So the simple solution can be just create two arrays. One can be of length m, one can be of length n. Okay, one array would represent the rows and one array would represent the columns. So you have to mark which row or which column you have to make 0. So in this example, like in the example 1, you have 0 at location 1, 1. So it means that the first row and first column has to be made 0. So you mark first one location in the rows array and first location in the columns array. So you mark the respective locations in the rows and the columns array. Okay, and then at the end you can use the rows and the columns array, and you can see what row number and what column number has to be made 0. Like all the contents have to make 0, and you can make that while reiterating the matrix. So that is the second solution. Now coming to the most optimized solution that doesn't use any memory, or that use constant memory. So that's something that we'll gonna use. That's something that we'll do right now. So the idea is really very simple. What we'll do is we'll not create any extra space. We'll utilize the space which we have. So we are given this matrix, like this is the question. You can see we have a function and matrix is given to us. So what we'll do is we'll utilize the first row and the first column of this matrix as our temporary arrays. So that's what we're gonna do. So for example, if we have this 0 in the middle, what we'll do is in the first row we'll mark here 0, which will actually indicate that this whole column has to be made 0. Similarly, we'll also mark this this location of the first column as 0. In clear terms, all we are doing is we are setting the first row and the first column as an indication of what rows and columns we have to set 0. So if we have any position in the first row and the first column as 0, it means that that entire row or that entire particular column has to be made 0. That's it, in simple terms. So So you can consider that the elements in the first row and the first columns, they actually tell us that which row or column has to be made 0. So to indicate it, what we'll do is, if we find 0 in the first row, it means that that particular column has to be set all 0. So all elements in that column will make 0. If in the first column we find any 0, it means that particular row will make 0. So why I am saying it, because first row is actually maintaining what columns are to be made 0, and first column is maintaining what rows are to be made 0, but this element is actually at the intersection of these two parts. So here you would never know that if the whole column is to be made 0, if the whole row is to be made 0, or both of them are to be made 0. So both of them are to be made 0 in case your 0 is present here only in the original matrix, in the first cell only. The only problem is the intersection part. Handle both of these cases, like if a row has to be made 0 or if column has to be made 0, which is not possible because it is one value and it can't represent two different things. So we will leave it. We'll rather create two different variables for the first cell, just to indicate the whether the first row has to be made 0 or the first column has to be made 0. So for first row and first column, since we have that intersection point, so we'll keep some separate variables for that. The point will be much clear once we start to code. So let's start with the code. So what we have to do is, I'll start iterating the matrix. If I find any element as 0, I will set first row at that particular location as 0 and first column at that particular location as 0. So that will indicate that a particular row and particular column has to become 0. Let's start the coding part. For I equals to 0 less than rows. So rows is matrix dot length, and then we'll go in columns, which is j is less than matrix at, we can say, 0 dot length and j plus plus. Okay, so if we find a 0 at a particular location, then we have to do something. We have to set the 0th column at that location, at that ith location, as 0, which will actually mark. Okay, so here we find the 0. Okay, j is 0, so I is actually going row wise and j is going column wise. So j is going column wise, so 0th column and ith row. So we are actually at this particular column, so we are marking this position as 0. Okay, and similarly 0th row and jth column as 0. This means 0th row, first row, and column is jth, where we found 0. So here we are marking 0. This is fine. Now, as I was telling about a problem, the first cell, if you mark 0 there, you don't know if it represents the row or the column. So just for that, we will create two variables, c equals to 0 and so just for that we'll create two variables, c equals to 0 and we can say r equals to 0. So c stands for columns and r stands for rows. Okay, now this part, the problem will actually arise if I find 0 in the first row or the first column, because we are not considering, we will not do the marking in case we find it in the first row or the first column. So to check it, I'll say if j equals to 0, then we have to do something. If I equals to 0, then we have to do something. So if j equals to 0, okay, I can be you can be at any row, but you are at the first column. So column is actually involved here, so you have to make a column as 0. So I will indicate it with a flag. Okay, so the C and R which we are creating the variables, you can actually refer to them as the flag variables, which will indicate us whether first row and first column have to be 0 or not. So C represents the first column and R represents the first row. So C has to be 0 in this case, because we found a 0. I have not equated it to 0. Yep. So now I have equated it to 0. So matrix at I comma j, if it's equal to 0, then we have to do this. Okay, so if j equals to 0, okay, and we find 0 at that location, it means that you need to make that column as 1. Okay, and similarly you have to make a row as 1 here, because if I equals to 0, it means you are at first row and you find 0 somewhere here, then it means this row has to be made completely 0. So that's the thing. And one more thing, you have to continue from here, because there is no marking that you have to do. If you have this row, 0 will already make that particular column 0. For the row we are making the marking, so you just have to continue from here. Similarly you have to continue from here. Okay, now in case if 0 is present at the first cell itself, it means that your row and column both have to be made 0. That's a special case. I'll write it here. If I equals to 0 and j is also equal to 0, in that case your C equals to 1, your R equals to 1, and we'll write continue here. Now I have done all the markings, right? Now my only task is to go through the first row and first column and see where are zeros present, and if I find a 0, I have to make the corresponding column and corresponding row as whole 0. So that's something which is left. So I'll go first in the rows. So for I equals to 0, I is less than, which is matrix dot length I plus. Okay, so if I find I 0, so in the 0th column, if I find anything as okay, let me use the if condition. If okay, so if I find anything as 0, then my task starts. So this means your I is varying, it means your row is changing, right? And your 0 indicates the first column. So you are going through the first column. If you find anything 0, you have to make that entire row as 0. So that means your entire row, which is j is equal to 0, j is less than matrix at 0 dot, okay, that entire row has to be made 0. So your ith row and that j, that whole row has to be made 0. So j equals to 0. So we are setting this. Now we have to do the same thing for the columns. It would be very similar, so I'll just copy this. Okay, the only difference would be I have to so this here I was going row wise, I have to go column wise. So I'll put 0 here, right, and I would be here and 0 would be here, because this is the first row. So the first row we are scanning, right? Column wise we are going. So first row we are scanning, and if we find something 0, we have to make the entire column, okay, the entire column as 0. So that entire column is actually this. So entire column here would be I and column would be here. Yes, so let me reiterate through this. I is now going your going in your first row. Okay, it is going in your first row. If you find anything 0, that entire column has to be made 0. Okay, so to go in that entire column, what we are doing is we are taking another loop, which is j is equal to 0, and matrix dot length, which is your entire column length, right? Column length, or I can say number of rows, anything you want to say. So column length, we are going, so this column length, which is j, which is the number of rows, right? And that we are setting here, and I would be fixed because you found 0 at that location. This will actually do the thing, the magic for us. Is the problem solved? There is just one little thing which is left, which is our first row and first column. So if r c equals to 1, so it means we need to set the first column as 0. So what does first column means? So what we are doing is, let's start, and we will go in the entire column and set it to 0. So for I is less than the column length. Okay, and we have to set the column as 0. So column, this would be the first column. So j is here, I is here, and it has been set to 0. I'll copy the same thing because we have to do a similar kind of thing for rows also. So if r is equal to 1, it means the first row has to be set 0. For that, I'll go in the entire row, in that particular entire row, which is the first row, and I'll this is the first row, and yeah, and I'll set it to 0. So I think, yeah, that's pretty it. Okay, so one thing which I actually missed out is, since we are not considering the first row and the first column, so we need not to start I from 0, and in both the cases we don't have to scan the first row and the first column from 0, because that 0th index, we are actually, that first element, we are actually leaving it. So that was the solution. So I have tested it, it will be accepted. And yep, if you have any questions or queries regarding this, you can write it in the comments.